Good afternoon, everyone. I am Xavier Salomon. I'm on the projects committee and I am one of the directors, trustees of Save Venice. Welcome to this wonderful afternoon talk, standing in the threshold, Carpaccio, St. Matthew, Reconsidered. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all the Save Venice members. I would like to thank in advance our speakers, Gabriele Matino and Valentina Piovan. And this is a talk about one of the most exciting projects we're working on at the moment. It is a project which centers on one of the scuole in Venice, the Scuola di San Giorgio degli Schiavoni, the so-called Scuola Dalmata, because of course it was a lay confraternity for Dalmatians, for people from what is today's Croatia. There was a very large population of people from Dalmatia in Venice at the time, of course, Dalmatia being part of the Venetian Republic at different times in its history. The great thing about this scuola is that it is the home of a cycle of incredibly beautiful canvases by Vittore Carpaccio, a painter that, say, Venice has been very interested in for a very long time. We have restored other great works by Carpaccio, most recently the paintings from the Scuola di Sant'Orsola, which are in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice. And this is a project that we are very proud of, and that we have decided, all of us fellow board members, to dedicate to one of us, to the art historian Patricia Fortini Brown, who has been a great scholar of Carpaccio and has published widely on the Scuola Dalmata and other works by the artist. Before I turn the microphone over to Gabriele and Valentina, I would like to thank especially all the donors who have come forward and have helped support this wonderful project. In particular, the major funding we received from the Versailles Foundation. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce this afternoon's speakers. Gabriele Matino is an independent scholar, an art historian and curator. He was a research fellow for Save Venice, and he has published, together with Patricia Fortini Brown, the book Carpaccio in Venice, a guide, one of the itinerary guides that Save Venice has sponsored, following in the footsteps of the ones done previously on Paolo Veronese and Tintoretto, which was published in 2020, last year. He has co-edited the conference proceedings of the Church of San Polo in 2021, this year, and also co-curated the exhibition Art, Faith and Medicine in Tintoretto's Venice, which many of us saw in Venice between 2018 and 19, which was held at the Scuola Grande di San Marco and was also sponsored by Save Venice. This afternoon's talk will also touch on topics that he is publishing soon. He has made major discoveries about Carpaccio's house and studio, which he's publishing in Colnaghi Studies Journal, coming up soon, and his work on the Calling of St. Matthew, which we'll hear more about today, is going to appear in the series Confraternitas, dedicated, the volume dedicated to the Scuola Dalmata. Valentina Piovan, instead, is a conservator, and she's currently working on the canvases at the Scuola Dalmata. She has been active in Venice and in the Veneto since 1994, when she was about 3 years old, I think. She has a degree in conservation from the Istituto Centrale del Restauro, and also an art history degree at the University of Padua. She has restored many works for us, for say Venice, in Venice, including Giovanni Bellini's St. Vincent Ferrer Polyptych in the Church of Santissimi Giovanni e Paolo, or Pordenone's St. Christopher and St. Rocco in the Church of San Rocco, Titian's St. Mark Enthroned, and Tintoretto's Wedding Feast at Cana in the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. She's also worked on Giotto's frescoes in the Arena, the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, and she's currently working on a project that's very close to my heart, which is Veronese's Feast in the house of Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory, in Vicenza, in the Basilica of Montemerico. Now, I would like to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A phase at the end of this talk. We'll have 10-15 minutes of that. So if you can please submit all of your questions in the Q&A sort of button at the bottom of this page, and then we will answer as many of the questions as we can in the time we have. Without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone on to Gabriele, who will get started. Thank you all for joining us.
So thank you, Xavier, for your kind presentation. Before I start, well, of course, good afternoon to everyone. Let me say what a honor it is to be talking today from the Rosen Library. For those who have come here before, I'm sure they all recognize the beautiful view of Venice in the painting behind me, the bookshelves and the frame with the pictures of David Rosen and many others, members of St. Venice. So today's talk is the partial result of a research fellowship granted to me by St. Venice. Xavier has already mentioned the published work that has come out from the research, and more is forthcoming. I must say that has been one of the best periods of my life. Having the opportunity to work on Carpaccio, going to libraries, archives, museum, monitoring, and this was very, very great, the restoration process of some of the most beautiful paintings by Carpaccio. And on the top of that, having the opportunity to work together with Patricia Fortini Brown, which was a huge honor. So for all of that, I want to thank St. Venice, I want to thank the donors, and I'm really, really grateful. So, well, it is time for me to start. Vittore Carpaccio is most renowned today for his narrative paintings in the Scuole, or lay confraternities of Venice, for which he produced more than 30 canvases. When in 1806, the Scuole were closed by Napoleonic decree, their possessions were sold at auctions and their painting dispersed. The Scuola Dalmata di Santi Giorgio e Trifone is the only one in Venice that still retains his original painting cycle by Carpaccio, rendering it one of the most remarkable artistic treasures of the city. In 2019, St. Venice sponsored a major restoration campaign of Carpaccio's cycle in the Scuola Dalmata. The campaign began with restorer Valentina Piovan treating the Calling of Matthew, a painting largely overlooked in current scholarship, and yet, as I shall discuss today, one of the most surprising examples of Carpaccio's artistry. The removal of the canvas from the wall offered me the opportunity to inspect it at close range, a rare privilege considering that it had not been moved since the previous restoration in the 1940s. Building upon my long conversation with Valentina Piovan, and I want to stress how crucial was the dialogue with Valentina, looking at the painting from a different point of view. It really helped me to figure out a new interpretation, or at least my attempt of a new interpretation of the painting. So when I say that, I really mean it. Building upon my long conversation with Valentina Piovan, this talk seeks to explore the painting iconography and reconsider it in light of a new visual and documentary evidence. In doing so, the presentation will address two key issues. First, it will demonstrate that Carpaccio painted the biblical tax collector Matthew not as a Jewish moneylender, as currently assumed, but as a Venetian banker within his workplace. Second, by examining Matthew's gesture and attitude, I will show that Carpaccio decided to depict the moment that preceded rather than follow the evangelist's choice to abandon his profession and follow Christ. I argue that in this painting, Carpaccio reinvented the biblical episode to interpret and indeed project the collective ideals of charity and love shared by the confraternal community. As specified in the statute book, or Mariegola, the Scuola Dalmata di Santi Giorgio e Trifone was founded on May 19, 1451, for residents in Venice from the so-called Albania Veneta, really a term broadly speaking, a region located in the southeastern Adriatic Sea where several Venetian colonies were located, including the seaports of Split and Dubrovnik, and of course including the city of Kotor, from where a number of officials of the confraternity, as well as many brothers of the confraternity, came from. The mission of the Scuola, as I shall discuss at the end of this discussion, was to provide material and spiritual assistance to its membership. On May 30th, the confraternity moved into a 14th century building owned by the Priory of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem and formerly occupied by the Ospedale di Santa Caterina. What you see here on the screen is actually the former Ospedale of Santa Caterina, whereas the Order of St. John, the Priory, was located and still is located right here. In 1452, the Scuola transformed the ground floor of the former Ospedale into a chapel. And in 1455, 2 meeting rooms had been created on the upper floor, where it is assumed Carpaccio's paintings were first installed. In 1551, the centennial of the Scuola's foundation, the Gastaldo Giovanni da Lissa started a campaign to renovate the building under the supervision of the proto of the Arsenale, Giovanni de Zon. On that occasion, the ground floor was rebuilt and the ceiling raised. And by 1586, Carpaccio's painting had been moved into the space from the upper floor. Now, I want to stress that this is an hypothesis. I'm referring to the paintings by Carpaccio being installed at first on the upper floor and then move on the ground floor. I'm saying it's an hypothesis. Most of the scholars are agreeing upon it. Nonetheless, Valentina and I are working on this issue, try at least to confirm in terms of archival evidence as well as the concrete evidence of the room. And so the idea is at least to confirm it or to challenge. We have just started working on it, so I won't discuss this issue today, but I hope that in the future we will be able to present you new data on this topic. Now, during that period, I'm referring to 1551, the sober 14th century facade was also updated with an elaborate design, articulated with pilaster and decorated with ornamental relief in the manner of Jacopo Sansovino. Pietro da Salo's marble relief of St. George and the Dragon was installed in the middle register of the facade. Now, before I go on discussing the other part of the relief, I think it is worth saying a few more words about Pietro da Salo, St. George and the Dragon, and in the process, well, let's say pay a little tribute to one of the greatest passion of Frederick, and of course, no surprise, I'm referring here to Jacopo Tintoretto, what else? So what you see here is a detail of St. George and the Dragon by Tintoretto, now at the National Gallery. It was made in 1555, so just a few years after Pietro da Salo marble relief. Now I'm showing this because a number of scholars believe that when Tintoretto work, and so in designing the iconography, he turned to for inspiration to Pietro da Salo. Scholars believe, in fact, that the legs of the horse just above the body of the dragon, as well as the mouth pierced by the spears of St. George, were inspired by the relief of Pietro da Salo. What is interesting here is to show how there was a dialogue between painting and sculpture. Most of the time we think about painters of that time, so Renaissance time, looking backward to example from the Roman period, for example. What we have here is in fact an example of a dialogue between a painter and a sculptor on the same time. And this is something that I think it was worth noticing and explaining to you. But let's go back to the facade. So dating to the period when the Ospedale di Santa Caterina was still active, a relief showing the Madonna enthroned with St. Catherine, the Baptist, and a knight can still be seen today at the apex of the facade. Pietro da Salo's relief does serve to bridge the past and the present of a building whose history spanned a century. Restored in 2001-2004, thanks to the support of the California chapter of St. Venice, the facade still welcomes visitors to one of the few Venetian scuole to survive, more or less untouched, and this is really extraordinary for Venice, by the spoliation of the Napoleon era. Carpaccio's activity in the Scuola most likely dated to the period 1501-1512. For his commission to execute 9 scenes, 2 paintings show episodes from the life of Christ, 3 from the life of St. Jerome, another 3 feature St. George, and 1 depicts St. Tryphon. The narrative cycle is well known to scholars and the public alike, since it includes some of the most important masterpieces of Italian Renaissance painting, including the St. George and the Dragon, very famous, and of course the Vision of St. Augustine. Now I will stop here for a moment and ask Valentina to share a PowerPoint. In the meanwhile, I just want to share with you my excitement for the recent restoration of the Vision of St. Augustine. The result is incredible, really. And so the next time you will be able to come to Venice, and I'm sure you will be able to come back soon, I urge you to go to the Scuola Dalmata and have a look with your eyes to this painting. You will rediscover Carpaccio under a new light. So without further ado, I give the floor to Valentina.
I would like to thank the Scuola Dalmata and Save Venice for supporting the conservation project, which is dedicated to Patricia Fortini Brown. Using the recently restored calling of St. Matthew and the vision of St. Augustine examples, I will present a conservation methodology with the objective of understanding Carpaccio's compositional technique and the artist's creative process. I identify the canvas seams in each painting and recorded the measurements of the pieces of the cloth. The calling of St. Matthew is a canvas made up of 2 pieces of lining cloth in a tight vertical weave. And the vision of St. Augustine is composed of 2 pieces placed horizontally due to the format. All the paintings are perfectly similar in material and form, and each painting is made of 2 pieces of linen cloth with the maximum width of 72 to 75 centimeters, unit with an overcast seam. This seems to conclude to a uniform construction of the supports made in sequence. Probably Carpaccio worked in the paintings consecutively without interaction. All the paintings have borders, as was customary on wooden panel paintings, leaving an area tinted in brown or black, defining the pictorial field in the canvas. These borders were Carpaccio's guidelines within which he would paint the scenes. This confirms that the paintings I have examined so far have not been cropped. For example, the leg of the figure of the calling of St. Matthew is intentionally outside the scene. The calling of St. Matthew canvas is slightly larger than the icon in the garden. During the conservation of St. Matthew, I discovered along the upper border and the right side a strip of bright color that was better preserved because it was originally covered by the frame. Perhaps to correct the difference in size once the painting were on the wall. Chemical analysis confirmed a thin layer of gesso and animal glue on the canvas. The gesso surface was being covered with the thin layer of lead white pigment to achieve a uniform surface on which to paint. The canvas is flexible, but also smooth and white, perfectly adaptable for the preparatory drawing. On the top of this, we found pigments typical of 15th century, extended with the 2 layers of color, taking advance to the transparencies of the paint, and mixing to achieve a darker or lighter tone. Here are 2 color samples, one in red lacquer and the other in copper green. Reading Carpaccio's creative process, there are new discoveries of his recently restored works, the vision of St. Augustine and the calling of St. Matthew. The compositional study of St. Augustine in the British Museum is well known and showing the first moment of Carpaccio's creative process. The figure and the objects are well defined, and the relationship with the light from the windows is already evident. The reflectography image revealed the preparatory drawing carried out with the brush. If we compare this image with that of the British Museum and the infrared image of the preparatory drawing with what we see in a visible light, we can observe a series of discoveries. In the British Museum drawing, we see an animal, maybe an ermine, extended on the floor with a long tail. We can see this in the preparatory drawing seen with the infrared here. And we can see traces of this with the naked eye here. While the artist was painting the canvas, he changed the animal into a dog. Carpaccio first painted St. Augustine without, Carpaccio first painted St. Augustine without bird, as seen in the detail on the drawing. He later painted a thick dark bird correcting the eyes and raising the mouth so that Augustine's chin was in better position. And not only, Augustine was first painted wearing a white robe, a tunic, and a red beret like a cardinal, without the dark cape, exactly how we see the figure in the British Museum drawing. And after having nearly completed the painting figure, Carpaccio added the dark bird. He inserted a dark cape with a hood, painted in tones of green that violently reflect the light. And he does also change the color of the beret from red to dark tone. And Carpaccio also modified the background of the doorway from black, visible in a small corner on the table, to dark red to balance the contrast. The portrait of Augustine may have been a precise request from the Scuola. I leave this question open to interpretation, but I'm proposing that it is Cardinal Bessarione. The abraded area of the bird were retouched using a light veiling, leaving a bit of red on the collar, like is all we see today of the red cardinal's robe beneath the first version. There are some objects seen in the painting that are in the reflectographic image and not in the drawing. In the painting, these objects are added, including the book on the left and the seal and its case, all leaning on the edge of the platform under Augustine's desk. These are all important objects that could help to identify the person represented by Augustine. Here we see the painting in two images, before and after conservation treatment. And here is the calling of St. Matthew before and after conservation treatment. Preliminary drawings are not known of the calling of St. Matthew, but the infrared reflectogram gives some new information of Carpaccio's creative process. Scholars have long identified two portraits in the calling of St. Matthew, the face seen in profile to the left of Matthew and the figure with the aquiline nose. In the preparatory drawing, seen in infrared, we see lines from the architecture showing through the face, indicating that the figure was added after the building was drawn. The image before restoration, and above all after the removal of the varnish of retouching from Belliciolis treatment in 1947, reveals that the repainting on the top of the head, the ear, and the part of the chin and the neck are very, very old. Some fonts have indicated the figure may be Sebastiano Michele, prior of the older Armata of Venice from 1490 to 1503. And the probable commissioner of the two paintings telling the stories of the life of Christ. Following indication that historians have suggested, I compare the profile in calling of St. Matthew with that of the commissioner Sebastiano Michele in Giovanni Bellini's Baptism of Christ in the Church of San Giovanni del Tempio, located next door to the Scuola. Carpaccio defined the features of his face in an approximative way compared to Bellini's detailed version. The repainting may thus be an incorrect addition or an insert on purpose to cover the bald head and the temple of the man. Noteworthy is the same color of the black toga with the white edge on the both figure. If the figure is indeed Sebastiano Michele, should the repainting be covered and the head being shown again without hair? If we compare the two profiles in infrared, it becomes clear that Carpaccio might have used Giovanni Bellini's work to make Michele's portrait, or both artists used the same source. The profile of one of the figures in the group of apostles seems to have been added by the artist while the painting was underway. If we look at the painting in natural light after it was cleaned, and also in infrared image, we can see the profile of an old bald man on the left and one behind him, barely visible. Thus, it is likely that in the first version, in that point, there were two faces, now covered by the person with the aquiline nose. There are no changes to Carpaccio's initial composition, but adjustments and modification carried out while painting, probably at the request of the commissioner. Here is an image of the blue and the red crest since in the end of the calling of St. Matthew, and that is also in the agony in the garden. The colors are those of the Vendramin family, whose crest is similar, although the yellow gold stripe is missing in the middle. Carpaccio drew the reliquary with the same shape of that of the reliquary of St. George that belonged to the Scuola. And is also very similar in form to a reliquary dated 1382 in the Museo Diocesano of Chioggia. The date of 1502 and the signature are on the inscription of the calling of St. Matthew, and in this image, we see it after the removal of the varnish. We see the same detail in the reflectography imaging with an infrared dosimetry camera after cleaning. Some of the letters of the signature are now clearer. Victor Carpaccius Fingebat, and the date is evident, 1502. The signature in the calling of St. Matthew is the same as that on St. Augustine, but in St. Augustine painting is without a date. The incision defining the space and the height of the characters of the letter are clear. Well, thank you. And now Gabriele, we conclude the lecture.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. Didn't I tell you the work she did was incredible? Okay, so we start now again with the calling of Matthew, delving into the iconography. Signed and dated in 1502, Carpaccio's calling of Matthew is based on the Gospel of Matthew, which narrates the encounter between Christ and the evangelist. Having left Nazareth, Christ traveled to the village of Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, where he will begin his ministry and heal the possessed, the paralyzed, and dying. In Capernaum, Christ called the Apostle Peter, Andrew, James, and John to join him, and it was there that he first met Matthew. As Christ walked through the street, he noticed a tax collector seated at a custom post. "Follow me," Christ said, and that was all. Matthew got up and followed him without hesitation. In Carpaccio's rendering of the episode, the setting has been transposed from Capernaum to a site outside the gates of a city in the Venetian terraferma. More importantly, the tax collector booth has been transformed into that of a 16th century money changer. In 1910, the art critic Osvaldo Bohm wrote in the Burlington magazine that Carpaccio had portrayed Matthew as a Jewish moneylender. This interpretation, which has since gained wide acceptance, and this is very amazing, was based on the incorrect assumption that in Carpaccio's time, Jews were forced by the Venetian Republic to wear a yellow band around their cap, exactly as the one you see here in Carpaccio, to distinguish themselves from Christians. Rather, the Venetian government required Jews to wear yellow badge on the outside of their clothing or a distinguished yellow cap, and not evidence at all suggests that the Jews were required to wear a head covering similar in any way to the one painted by Carpaccio. Now, the practice of wearing special clothing to distinguish Jews dates back to the Middle Ages. In the Christian world, the first official church legislation on Jewish dress was instituted in the year 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council ordered that Jews had to be distinguishable from the other people by the nature of their clothes. Over the centuries, secular authorities complied with the church prescription by issuing a number of provisions on the matter of Jewish dress. Venice, of course, made no exception. Beginning in 1394, the Senate decreed that all the Venetian Jews had to wear on their exterior clothing a yellow circle as large as a loaf of bread, costing 4 denarii. In people's mind, the color yellow had negative connotations, as it was also used to make prostitutes and pimps readily visible. In 1408, the government specified the material with which the circular badge had to be made, namely a yellow braided rope a finger in width. And by 1430, the requirement had been extended to the Jews of the entire Venetian state, that is both the terraferma and the Stato da Mare. Now, what you see here on the screen is an example of how Jews were represented back then. This is a representation, of course, of the martyrdom of Saint Simon of Trent, and you can see all Jews with this yellow circle placed on the exterior of their clothing. Now, the same thing can be seen also outside of Italy. I'm showing here, well, almost the same iconography, though the executors has been rearranged in the pictorial field, but nonetheless, you see how the tormentors of Saint Simon are wearing the same yellow circle. Of course, this is, we are in Germany here with a woodcut made in 1493. Another example, which is worth mentioning, is Michelangelo's Aminadab lunette, where you can see again the yellow circle placed on the outside of the gown of this figure. Now, what is interesting here is that we are in the Sistine Chapel, so it's not placed just within a church, but it was commissioned by the church, the institution, which of course instructed Michelangelo to represent the Jew in this specific way. The last example that I want to show you, to show how it actually spread all over Europe, is this document. It's a letter patent issued by King Ferdinand I, 1st August 1551. And here on the corner, you can see the actual yellow circle in the dimension and width that was supposed to be, and that all Jews must have worn on their clothes. Now, let's go back to Venice. And so in Venice, legislation on the yellow circle remained almost unaltered until 1496, when the yellow circle was replaced by a more clearly visible yellow barretta or cap. From this time forward, the distinctive yellow cap, and I want to stress is not a red one with a thin golden band, as we have seen in Carpaccio, but actually just a yellow cap, became the most distinctive garment of the Venetian Jews. This is how any Venetian, including Carpaccio, of course, could easily recognize a Jew at a glance, and that is how Jews were portrayed in contemporary painting. What you see here is a clear example in which both the yellow circle and the yellow barretta or cap have been worn by these characters. So Venetian legislation on the Jewish yellow badge remained unchanged during Carpaccio's time, and regulation concerning the yellow cap had been introduced 6 years before Carpaccio painted the calling of Matthew. Carpaccio was surely familiar with such distinctive marks, including the ramification of depicting them in a painting on the conversion of Matthew. If indeed Carpaccio had intended to portray a Jewish moneylender, then it seems likely that he would have depicted Matthew wearing either a yellow circle or a yellow cap, or perhaps, as we have just seen, both of them. Rather, Carpaccio portrayed Matthew in the guise of a rich man who cared enough about fashion to wear a cap that matched both his red velvet gown and his sleeveless overcoat draped in golden brocade. He was a wealthy man who was crazy for fashion, nothing more. So Matthew appears to be portrayed as a Christian Venetian money changer. He's shown on the threshold of a Venetian banco, a 15th century bank similar to those that once surrounded Campo San Giacomo in Rialto. The booth is located on the corner of a building whose structure recalls that of some shops still standing in the Rialto area. 2 carpets, probably of Islamic manufacture, have been laid across the wooden countertop. As demonstrated by Renan Müller, their display refers to the so-called banco da tapeto, a term that in Venice indicated a licensed deposit bank whose sureties have been approved by the Consoli dei Mercanti. Actually, this is not just a peculiarity of Venice, but banchi da tapeto were also common in Genoa and in Florence, and we will see an example of a banco da tapeto in Florence in a few minutes. Now, on the right-hand side of the banco, extending over the edge of the countertop, sits an unusual funnel-shaped tray. This was customarily employed by the Venetian bankers for counting and stacking coins. And what I'm doing here is showing to you two examples. So I'm comparing a detail from Carpaccio's painting to a drawing and an illuminated manuscript from the 14th century. On both occasions, you can see the same tool. Look at this. This is a representation of a camerlengo di comune. He's using the same tool, the same funnel-shaped tray, is pouring coins there to be counted and then pour again inside the bag. The same happened in this really beautiful illumination, actually depicting the same episode painted by Carpaccio, where again you can see the same funnel-shaped tray. And it is a shame that we don't know the name, so how it was called. Nonetheless, this proved that this specific tool was in use in Venice at least a century before Carpaccio painted it. On the other side of the counter, gold ducats and silver lire wait to be moved into the tray, counted, put into bags, and deposited into the safe at the back of the work table. The walls are decorated with a floral motif on a green background, perhaps a silk tapestry or a corridoro, while leather bags overflowing with receipt and debtor notes hang from upholstery nails above. Now, this portion of Matthew's booth is reminiscent of the trompe-l'oeil Carpaccio painted some years before on the reverse side of the famous Hunting of the Lagoon. And I bet that most of you have thought about it in the very moment I've seen the detail from the Calling of Matthew. Nonetheless, in Carpaccio's Calling of Matthew, Carpaccio has depicted the common habit among bankers of putting receipts into designated pockets or hanging them on a tape nailed on the wall. And again, you can see it, the same pockets and the tape on the wall in this example from Florence. It is a representation of a bank in Florence. So at this point, I would like to make three observations. First, the care with which Carpaccio selected and portrayed these details shows that he spent long hours designing the setting of the scene. Indeed, it seems reasonable to assume that the painter visited Rialto to copy from life a banco da tapeto in preparation for his composition. His intention, as Patricia Fortini Brown might suggest, was surely to confer upon it a look of documentary authority. So Carpaccio here was trying to represent something immediately recognizable by the beholder, and by doing that and by setting the biblical event in something that was immediately recognizable by the beholder, it will turn it in something real, something that will happen again in front of the beholder at his own time. Secondly, in terms of the unfolding of the story, Matthew's booth acts as his starting point. Proceeding from left to right, it is from the threshold of his door that Matthew takes his first step toward Christ, who in turn bends his right knee to step forth and resume his journey with his new disciple at his side. Thirdly, and on a deeper level, the booth also functions as a temporal watershed in Matthew's life. If taken together, the carpet, the funnel-shaped tray, the safe, and so on and so forth, well, they all relate to the secular life of Matthew. What I'm saying here is that in Carpaccio's painting, the banco da tapeto, the structure, the bank itself, stands for the life Matthew lived before meeting Christ. That is the very life the Savior is now asking Matthew to give up. To design the Calling of Matthew, Carpaccio must have explored the subject's pictorial tradition. By the end of the 15th century, two main iconographic types had developed in parallel, one focusing on Matthew's acceptance of Christ's call, the other representing Matthew's initial indecision. As for the former, it is worth recalling the example of Andrea Orcagna triptych of St. Matthew, which was commissioned by the Arte del Cambio, namely the Guild of the Moneychanger, to adorn a pillar of the Church of Or San Michele in Florence. Now, in Orcagna's painting, the tax collector is portrayed in the act of leaving his booth. As you can see, his hands are lifted up in both prayer and acceptance. His eyes are cast upon Christ, who, supported by his disciples, shows Matthew the way. So apparently, Orcagna adhered closely to the biblical story of the gospel in that he depicted Matthew obeying to the call without hesitation. Another point worth mentioning here, as I suggested before, is the fact that above the countertop of the banco, of the bank, we see, exactly as in the case of Carpaccio, a carpet laid above it. So this is a visual evidence of the fact that even in Florence, and we're talking here about almost a century before, there were banchi da tapeto. And again, I want to stress that here we're talking about a painting commissioned by the Guild of the Money Changer. A different approach can be observed in a now lost fresco attributed to a follower of Pietro da Rimini and once placed in the chapel of St. Matthew in the church of Santa Maria in Portofuori, Ravenna. The scene, as you can see, has been moved from the square facing Matthew's booth to its interior. Christ stands on the edge, his body turned toward the observer, his arms stretched forth in an attitude of urgent insistence, his head turned back to Matthew, who nonetheless remains seated at his desk. Matthew is thus depicted as torn between the impulse to follow Christ and his desire for wealth. In fact, his left hand feeling his gold as he contemplates his decision. In discussing the many visual sources used by Carpaccio to design his compositions, Fortini Brown stated that not a single motif was ever adopted wholesale and untransformed. The calling of Matthew abides by this strategy. As in the case of Orcagna's painting, Carpaccio represented Matthew leaving his workplace, the left foot stepping on the dusty ground, the hand holding that of Christ and the body leaning toward the Savior as is drawn by his call. They all find their roots in the iconographic tradition embodied by the Florentine master. And by saying that, I'm referring, of course, to Orcagna and his own representation of the calling of Matthew. At the same time, however, Carpaccio shows his awareness of the other pictorial tradition. On his way out, Matthew reaches back and rests his right hand upon the countertop. At first glance, one might assume that he's holding it for support. Rather, Matthew is immersing his fingers into a pile of coins as if momentarily unable to separate himself fully from his wealth. Carpaccio thus carefully combined the two iconographic traditions to create a new visual design. It may be for this reason that, as discussed by Valentina just a few minutes ago, the painter decided to include the word fingebat, he invented, on the cartellino in the bottom left corner of the canvas. In appropriating this verb, often employed within humanistic circle, Carpaccio boldly identified himself as the fictor or creator of the work, signaling his capacity to go beyond the verbatim biblical narrative in order to give form to a word conceived entirely within his own mind. By merging the two iconographic motifs, Carpaccio thus invented a composition that works by visual opposite. Matthew's holding Christ's hand is counterbalanced by Matthew's touching the coins, thus revealing the tension of Matthew's inner struggle to leave the past and choose Christ. By this means, Carpaccio has transformed Matthew's formerly immediate decision into a dilemma, albeit momentarily, of emotional and psychological depth. To conclude, and I promise I'm about to finish and I thank you for your patience. Well, so to conclude, I will suggest that Carpaccio reimagine the biblical episode in the calling of Matthew to suit the needs of the Scuola and perhaps of a particular patron. Now, Valentina has already mentioned the figure of Sebastiano Michel as one of the candidates as patron of the painting. As far as this paper is concerned, I prefer to focus on the broader picture and focus on the needs of the Scuola, try to figure out what was crucial for the Scuola and how that could be represented or actually projected by the painting made by Carpaccio. Like all other lay confraternities in early Renaissance Europe, the Scuola Dalmata embraced the virtues of religious solidarity and material charity. In particular, the Scuola's membership participated in collective prayer, accompanied the deceased to the grave, and shared in commemorative masses in the hope of gaining protection in the afterlife. For its living members, especially those who were poor, the Scuola provided alms, food, housing, and medical care. So considering the degree of personal sacrifice expected from the Scuola members, it seems plausible to imagine that Carpaccio paintings serve as a visual aid to teach the brothers to abide by the rules shared by the confraternal community. Accordingly, the painting would have urged the brothers to identify with Matthew and his inner ethical conflict, as they chose, between their own interest and that of the higher calling of the Scuola. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, and thank you, Valentina, for this really thought-provoking lecture, talk. And I'm really looking forward to the restoration of the other paintings, because if this is all the material that comes out of one of them, I can't imagine what will come out of all of the others once we finish the project. I would like to point out that our Venice director, Melissa Kohn, is also joining us for this Q&A part of the event. Welcome, Melissa. Great to see you. Great to see all of you in Venice. I would like to remind all of you following us that you can submit questions for Valentina and for Gabriele, and also for Melissa more generally about the project in the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your screen. So we have some questions. One question that has already come in, and I think, Gabriele, you've answered this to some degree already, but I think you can maybe talk to us a little bit more about it. And it is about the Banco di Tapeto. And the question is, could those banks be established outside of the Jewish ghetto? And I think, as I say, you've answered that to some degree, but would those type of banchi be in the ghetto, outside of the ghetto, both, or just one way? What do you know about them?
Yeah, they were, and I think they had to be placed in the Rialto area, so in the so-called Banco Giro, which is this area just in front of the church of San Giacomo di Rialto, nearby some of the most, some of the favorite bar in Venice right now. And yeah, they were in place in the ghetto. Beside, the painting was made some 14 years before the ghetto was established. In fact, at first, when Bohm suggested that was a representation of a Jew, he started by saying that the banco was placed outside the city. It was a period when this banchi could be placed outside the city in the terraferma. So no, the Banco da Tapeto could not be placed inside the ghetto, and it was in fact in the Rialto area.
Thank you. I see there is a very technical question for Valentina about the use of IR, of reflectography. So one question is, what frequency was used, but also when did you take the IR? Was it done before, during, and after restoration, or at what point in the cleaning did you do it?
Thank you. ER analysis generally is often used before at first, and during the cleaning and after the cleaning canvas and some cleaning paintings, because it's very important to understand what can I say, the underdrawing, to know the underdrawing also of the painting before to work, to begin to restore paintings. Yeah, sorry, because my English is not so I don't know.
Your English
so
is
ER is very important also after, but it prefer to generally it is important to use at the beginning and during the cleaning. Thank you.
We have another question for Gabriele about the textiles and clothes in the Calling of St. Matthew. You talked a little bit about the outfit of the banker and the cap. Could you tell us something more about the type of textiles that Carpaccio is showing and what you think the sources may be, what type of textiles those would be?
Oh, wow. This is a great question, and I'm not sure I will be able to answer it. I must say that I focus more on these distinctive marks, or try to confess the fact that there were actually distinctive marks of Jews. So I haven't focused on that. I mentioned some brocade. I'm sorry, I don't really have a clear answer to that. Nonetheless, it does look like a really wealthy person and really much interest in fashion, I would say. And yeah, probably my answer ends here, I'm afraid.
We have a comment rather than a question, rather interesting one from a good friend of St. Venice, from Rosella Mamoli Zorzi. And she's asking if the tool that you showed, Gabriele, the sort of funnel-shaped tool of the bank, may be related to a tool called Sessola, or Sessola, entirely
That's
sure.
right.
It was used
That's
to
right. Which
take
is
water out of boats, but also to measure
Oh.
grain. What do you think?
Oh, well, this is interesting. In fact, the shape is very similar, although it is used in a different context completely. So for those who are not familiar with Venice, they are used to pour water outside the boats after it has rained, or, you know, if there is some leaks or whatever. And this is very interesting and something that I would like to work on more. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for this comment. This is very useful.
And a question really for more maybe for Melissa about the situation in Venice right now and the Scuola. Do we know if the Scuola will remain open to visitors in 2021? I mean, I suppose this is the million-dollar question right now.
Yes, it did close during the pandemic because there weren't, all the museums in Venice did, and they have to follow the same guidelines. But the Scuola is planning to reopen and get reorganized now that the museums in Venice are able to greet the public. So definitely this summer, I think there will be an opportunity for people coming to Venice to visit the Scuola.
Great. Another question for Valentina, actually, two questions, same question really. You know, how long does it take for you to work on these paintings? And I know that obviously with different paintings in the cycle, there are different time frames, but can you give us a bit of an idea, having worked now on two of them and starting on a third one, what's your timing been like on this project?
Well, now I'm restoring the third, and so I have another 7 paintings to complete my restoration. But I think that probably it will I will take 1 year and a half to finish the cycle. And generally to restore, for example, the calling of St. Matthew, yes, I spent, I think 3 or 4 months, just because it was the first paint, the first panels, yes, the first canvas. So we lost a lot of time to check more than generally. Yeah, can I say now I can restore the paintings in quickly, because I know what I can I say, what I should do. I don't know.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's true that especially with cycles like these, the big phase is really at the beginning in terms of working out what is needed and what the condition of works, especially in a cycle like this, often is not exactly the same. So some are more complicated than others.
Yeah, and
so
more
it's
bigger
difficult.
also. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and it's one of those questions, you know, people also always ask, how long did it take Carpaccio to paint one of these canvases? And of course, you know, we don't really know, but it's variable depending on a number of different elements. We have another question for Gabriele, and I suppose also for Valentina. The profile portrait, and I'm assuming this refers to the man with the aquiline nose rather than the other man we've identified. Could it represent the head of the Scuola? Or do we have any?
Which one do you think is she or he is referring to?
I'm assuming they refer profile. I mean, they're both profiles. So, I mean, one we know who he is. I'm assuming it's the other one.
From my point of view, the portrait of the donor is the one indicated by Valentina. Now, we can agree or not on Sebastiano Michele, but it is quite interesting how he's placed just behind St. Matthew. In a way, will suggest, and this is just to go on the different way in reference to Valentina, but it will suggest that they share the same name. This is just an hypothesis. What is really interesting there, and Valentina stressed it, is that it was painted after the building was created. And another really, really interesting thing, we actually don't have an answer to that, is the fact that that portrait is the only figure that doesn't have a shadow. And this is something really peculiar because the painting really works with light. And this is thanks to Valentina. The restoration has really, you know, shed new light on the way Carpaccio used light. Sorry for using the same word, but nonetheless, this is very interesting and something that we should work on more. The fact that that very figure doesn't project a shadow. And so I will identify the donor of the painting in that figure rather than the one with the long nose. But this is just an idea, and there might be some apostle around there. There should be at least 3 or 4. I don't know if Valentina wants to add something, or we may be fine with this.
No, that makes sense. And I think it's true that in so many of Carpaccio's cycles, but many other painters in Venice, you have these insertions of portraits in them. And it's often very difficult to find out who they are. I mean, it makes sense that they are Scuola members. It may not necessarily be the head of the Scuola. It could be someone that was involved with the cycle for a reason or another, or someone that was involved with the painter. If there are any other questions for Q&A, we can also answer them later on and write back to you. Please let us know. But I would like to draw this talk to a conclusion, and I would like to thank again Valentina and Gabriele for all their insights on these great works, for their research, for their wonderful restoration work. And of course, you know, it's so important for us at Save Venice not only to preserve these works for future generation, but also to research their history and present it to all of our friends and followers and the wider public. You know, just to remind everyone that we have raised almost $400,000 for the cycle, for the full cycle, and we're very eager, of course, to raise the remaining 78,000. We're almost there. So please, if you're interested in this campaign, let us know. Any donation towards the Carpaccios is obviously welcome. You can contact our New York office, or you could just write to newyork@savevenice.org, or look up our website, and there is plenty of information there. And if you would like to know more also about Carpaccio, about his role as a painter in Venice and his works that you can see in Venice and the Veneto. As I mentioned at the beginning, Gabriele is one of the authors of this wonderful guidebook, which was edited by Patricia Fautini Brown and Gabriele himself, which you can also buy through Save Venice for $30. I think it's also available on Amazon if that's easier for you. And of course, if you're in Venice, it's in many of the Venetian bookstores in both English and Italian. So, and it is a wonderful tool to go around Venice for walks and actually find works, many works by Carpaccio in some of the scuole, in the museums, in the churches, and a number of other places. You may have received this book already if you are a member at the associate level or above. If not, as I say, you can buy it, or you can up your membership and you will receive a copy of the book. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one of these events. Thank you and good afternoon.